McDonald, your host for Village in Motion today, January 16th, 2006. First of all, before we get to our subject today and why we're here and the special day it is, I want to give my condolences to all the Redskin fans who are feeling very low today. I know how you feel because my glorious Patriots didn't make it either. So we'll just wait for next year, I guess. Put it aside, look ahead, and happy days will be here again. But today is another special day, and it's the Reverend Martin Luther King's day, and I think he's worth remembering, and there's few people that are worth remembering that worked with him, which we're going to cover today. So we have two guests that will do that, very informative, because I'm just not up on, I'm learning a lot, being exposed to these people, and I hope you are too, and I hope you enjoy it. I was never big on history, but I'm beginning to find that it's interesting, and missed a lot in life, I'll tell you, while it was all going on, and but maybe I'll catch up. So today we have Dean Carson, who is going to talk to us about the Reverend Martin Luther King, and then we have Mabel Thornton, who will talk about Rosa Parks, a woman that I just was never familiar with. I knew what she did with her big moment, a small woman who became very great by just saying the word no, and but there was much more to her. And so we're going to probably learn a little bit more about the Reverend and Rosa from our two guests. So we'll start with Dean first, who will inform us of the Reverend Martin Luther King.
Well, thank you, Mary. The celebration of Dr. King's birthday in Virginia did not come easily to this state. It was one of the last states, indeed, to recognize that as a separate day of remembrance. Virginia was just emerging from its many, many years of segregation and discrimination, and it took them a long time. They first tried to enact a combination Lee-Jackson-King Day, which didn't go over very well with either the supporters of Robert E. Lee or the supporters of Martin Luther King. But eventually, after a lot of legislative struggles, the legislature finally did settle on approving the recognition of the 16th of January as Martin Luther King Day, respecting his birthday. I only met Dr. King once, and that was in the early January days of 1968, when we had a meeting at the Department of the Interior with Dr. King and Reverend Ralph Abernathy, who came as representatives of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Mm-hmm. At that time, King was its president and Reverend Abernathy was its executive. We were going to talk about the development of the Poor People's Campaign, which was to have been Dr. King's next really major effort in the whole area of civil rights and human rights. Mm-hmm. And we were talking about how we would organize the city to prepare for a march on Washington by representatives of the poor people of this country, which was King's great belief. He was turning, in fact, from the emphasis he had on the development of civil rights, such as voting rights, to an issue involving economic rights. Mm-hmm. He felt that one of the last great areas of need in this country was to develop a program of equal economic rights for all people, and especially for the poor people of the United States. And so he decided that after the passage of the civil rights legislation and after the emergence of black power and the urban riots of the previous summer, we should launch a poor people's campaign to address economic inequalities with nonviolent direct action. King's great emphasis on nonviolence was, of course, the hallmark of his leadership of all of these movements. Unfortunately, the timing of the Poor People's Campaign was, of course, almost totally destroyed by King's assassination in 1968.
That I remember well.
But even though that happened, SCLC decided that they would go ahead with his vision of a Poor People's Campaign in Washington.
Yeah.
And they did, and we continued negotiating with SCLC for the use of the mall and the development of various programs to feed and house a great many people.
Is that when the tent city went up?
Pardon?
Was that when the tents were on the mall?
That's correct. That was a so-called
See,
Resurrection City,
Remember some of it.
which came in the spring, not too long after the assassination in Memphis. And about 7,000 people came to the mall to begin development of the Poor People's Campaign, which was to be started in all the great cities across the country. It was not to be just in Washington, but in many great cities. But of course, the fact that King's leadership was no longer available did somewhat slow the progress of that whole movement. King had hoped to address what he called the limitations to our achievements with its second phase, the Poor People's Campaign, which would merge his tactics from his original civil rights campaign to his second phase goals, which were to involve all poor people, including not only blacks, but Indians and the labor movement headed by Cesar Chavez and other disenfranchised economically people who really were in great need of help in this country. The migrant workers, people in very low-paid jobs, were to come and impress upon the Congress the necessity for further legislation in the area of economic rights. King said at that time, it must not be just black people. It must be all poor people. We must include American Indians, Puerto Ricans, Mexicans, and even poor whites. And so the campaign, which was planned as a kind of a massive world or nationwide campaign of civil disobedience, would bring 1,500 protesters to Washington to lobby Congress and other governmental entities for an economic Bill of Rights. Well, a lot of the people in charge of government agencies in Washington were very concerned about that. We had not too long ago riots in Washington in which a good part of the central urban core was set on fire and burned, and they were very concerned that this would just be another demonstration of violence. And it was not at all what King had in mind, and it was not at all what Reverend Abernathy had in mind, who had assumed the leadership of SCLC after King's death. But we agreed that we would help with the logistics of a mall city to be called Resurrection City, and I think those of us who remember that spring when Resurrection City opened in March was rainy.
Oh, I know, it was
And
terrible.
the city was muddy, and it was just, the tents were, of course, wet, and the people were wet, and they were cold.
Yes, sir.
And they hadn't made adequate arrangements to feed people, and they hadn't made adequate arrangements for getting showers, and it was just really a difficult time for everybody.
Yeah.
Our building, the Department of Health, Education, Welfare, was just off the mall, right across the street from Resurrection City, and unlike some of the other agency heads, Secretary Celebrezzi of the department said, "This is terrible. We can't afford this. Let us throw open our building to these people, and we've got a little gym here, and we've got some showers, and we've got a big cafeteria, and why don't all of you people that work here just stay home for a few days, and I'm going to open my building, and we'll let everybody come in and at least get a hot meal in the cafeteria and get a warm place to sit down and get a little rest." And we did that, and it was well received by the people down there. And of course, instead of 1,500 people, they got 7,000 people on the mall, which was many, many more than they had planned for.
Right.
But it was an exciting time, and it was pretty successful in terms of the impact it had on the Congress and the impact it had on the passage of some economic legislation, which had been long delayed in the Congress.
Well, that I remember well, but I don't remember anybody opening up. I don't remember reading that in the paper, that somebody opened the doors. But
Well,
I do remember.
There were a lot of big agencies all along Independence Avenue. There was a Federal Aviation Agency, FAA, and there was a Defense Department there, and there was the Department of Agriculture. And all of those agencies hired extra guards and put up extra bars on the doors and wanted me to be sure that these people would not be able to get into their buildings. And they sort of crouched in their offices in fear and trembling. And we said, no, that's not the way to do that. These people are good people, and they're here for a legitimate reason, and let's do what we can to help them.
And you're still
And
here?
I think at least, I met with Reverend Abernathy practically every day, and sometimes 2 and 3 times a day. And we solved problems, and we got things done, and it worked out fine. And I think SCLC was pleased that at least one federal agency was willing to cooperate with them.
Yes, but we still have so many of the poor with us today. And I think the life of Rosa Parks, the things that she went through with as a young person, will help us to see why we still have so many poor, black and white. And as we look at her life, we see that she was born in 1913. And her father was a carpenter and her mother was a teacher. However, the father left the family early because he could not seem to have been able to get the kind of work he wanted in the little town where her parents lived. She was born in Tuskegee, Alabama, which was a good place because Tuskegee Institute was there. But she came back to her parents' home. The grandfather of Rosa, who was John Edwards, and her grandmother was Rose Edwards. And she started school in 1918, when she was about 5 years old. Now, the schools at that time for blacks was the school that in that neighborhood was, as in most neighborhoods, was very poor. Sometimes they were held in black churches. In her case, this one was a little schoolhouse. But she didn't get much education because the schools were only open for blacks 5 months during the year, where they were open for whites 9 months.
Oh, I never realized that.
Yes, this is all across the South where you had the economics dependent on agriculture. And the black parents had to keep their children out to work in the fields, in the cotton fields and rice fields and whatnot. And that went on for many, many years. And very few blacks got an education. But Rosa's family was very much for the fact that they wanted their children educated. And as I said, the mother had been a teacher. The grandfather had been able to somehow get her educated. And she started school in the community, but that little school closed down, and then she ended up, she and her brother, going to school with their mother. The mother was teaching in a school that was 8 miles away, and the mother would stay there during the week, but they walked that long distance to school while she was in elementary school. And she then wasn't able to get any further than, I say, the 5th grade there, 5th or 6th grade, because there were no high schools in the county for blacks. And she stayed there as long as she could, but even more than the schools, the things that bothered her were the fact that the white children would attack them. And she was not one to take it, because her grandfather had always taught her, don't let anybody misuse you.
Right.
You are as good as anybody.
Just feisty.
And yes, she was very feisty. And she and her playmates as such. So she did not let them abuse her. And then after she was about 11 years old, she went to school in Montgomery, Alabama. But here again, it wasn't the public schools, because there were no public schools for blacks, high schools. It was a school that was founded by the Quakers, and she was very impressed there with the teachers who had given up their lives to come south and teach black children.
Wow.
And the school had been burned down several times by the whites of the local whites, because they didn't want this to happen.
Yeah.
But they stayed there, and they taught them well. Now, just speaking about no black schools in Alabama, this was also true of Virginia. And Dean spoke of how slow Virginia was to do the right thing in the economic and whatnot. But they did the wrong thing with schools also. There were no schools in Virginia my county, for instance, Amelia County, for blacks, no high school until 1935. And it helped to hinder us from progressing.
Right.
Yes. Then she went to private school, but she still wasn't able to finish because her grandmother took ill, and she had to go back home to take care of her grandmother. The grandfather was the one that was the big influence on her. She tells about how he would sit at night with his gun on his lap, because the Ku Klux Klan was riding during the nights, trying to intimidate them. And he was determined that if anybody came to break in his door, that they would not get in. And there were other incidents in her memory that made her, I guess, it made her strong and made her determined. When she first went to Montgomery, she had to get used to the segregation as such, because out in the country, you didn't have public transportation and things of that nature. And in Montgomery, there were the water fountains labeled colored and white. And once she saw this white man with a dog who drank out of the white person's fountain, and then he let his dog drink out of the black person's fountain. These kind of things just built up in her a determination that something needed to be done about what was happening to them. And then they couldn't try on shoes in the store. They had to take their foot and put it on a cardboard and trace it, and the parents go to the store and get shoes. Then there were always news of lynchings. And in the film about her, they was showing once that she came across a man that had been lynched, was hanging by the tree. So these kind of things sort of just built up a determined, I won't say hate, because she didn't hate. She still was a loving person, but she was determined not to be treated unfairly. So she came up under circumstances that helped to mold her into being a strong person. In 1932, she married Raymond Parks, and he also was a person who had worked for civil rights. I don't know whether you heard of the Scottsboro case of these men, black men, about 7 of them, I think, who were unfairly accused of raping 2 white women. And they were sent to jail and to be lynched, or more or less, but they were, after a long time, some of them were released and cleared. Mm-hmm. But her husband was one of the person working behind the scenes for that. But it was a scary situation, because if they had found out, the Ku Klux Klan and even the policemen, they would watch these people and they would arrest them. It wasn't until 1933 that she received her diploma, and she was 20 years old. And this also was not rare for blacks in that time.
Yeah.
Because, as we have said, there was no black high schools in most of the counties of the South,
Well,
and
she
even
was
in some
determined.
cities. But she was determined, and it was even after she was married that she got her high school diploma. They both at some point worked at the Maxwell Field. That was the local Army Air Force base. And while they were on the base, they could ride on the buses, and they weren't segregated. But then as soon as they got off those buses trying to get back into Montgomery, they had to get on segregated buses. So I'm sure that did something to her also. They were both active in the civil rights movement. And in 1943, she became the secretary of the NAACP. And Mr. E.T. Nixon was the head of the NAACP. And he was also president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. This was a union that had been organized by A. Philip Randolph. And there again, there had been bloodshed of blacks in order to organize that union. But he had come back south as he traveled back and forth, and had organized this union. She had already had a problem in 1943 on the bus with the same driver that had arrested her in 1955. And she had promised that she wasn't going to get back on that bus. You see, what you would have to do if you were black, you'd go in the front door, pay your money, then get off and go to the back.
Yeah, I just couldn't believe that. Never knew that.
But that really happened there in Alabama and other places in the South. In 1943, she tried to register to vote, and it took her 2 years. Whites would register by simply going in, signing a card, and paying that $1.50. Blacks, they would put off for many years. And Rosa had been put off for about 3 years. And then when they finally let her register, she had to pay all of the back poll tax. She had to pay $16.50 altogether in order to register. Now, she speaks of 1949 as being a very bad year for them because there was so much violence and hatred. A lot of black veterans had returned, and most of us who had brothers and friends in the Army who went away can come back and came back can attest to this. The whites did not want to see a black man in a uniform, And they were treated even worse than they had been before the war.
Yeah.
And in the case there in Alabama or in South Carolina, there was a man whose eyes had been put out because they don't know why, but and he was beaten, but nobody was ever prosecuted for that. Her brother, Sylvester McCullough, he couldn't take it any longer. He had served in Europe and the Pacific.
Yeah.
And when he came back, he couldn't find a job, and he just could not take it, so he went and settled in Detroit. And that's why she finally ended up in Detroit. Now, I hope we have time enough to go to what happened to her that night, because I would like to read about what happened to her. But we can see how these events in her life had molded her character. And I want to read this, her own account from her book, My Story. She said, when I got off from work that evening of December the 1st, I went to Court Square as usual to catch the Cleveland Avenue bus home. I didn't look to see who was driving when I got on, and by the time I recognized him, I had already paid my fare. It was the same driver who had put me off the bus back in 1943, 12 years earlier. He was still tall and heavy with red, rough-looking skin, and he was still mean-looking. I didn't know if he'd been on that route before. They switched the drivers around sometimes. I do know that most of the time, if I saw him on a bus, I wouldn't get on it. I saw a vacant seat in the middle section of the bus and took it. I didn't even question why there was a vacant seat, even though there were quite a few people standing in the back. If I had thought about it at all, I would probably have figured maybe someone saw me get on and did not take the seat but left it vacant for me. There was a man sitting next to the window and two women across the aisle. The next stop was the Empire Theater, and some whites got on. They filled up the white seats, and one man was left standing. The driver looked back and noticed the man standing. Then he looked back at us. He said, "Let me have those front seats." Because they were the front seats of the black section, didn't anybody move. We just sat right where we were, the four of us. Then he spoke a second time. "You all better make it lighter on yourselves and let me have those seats." The man in the window seat next to me stood up, and I moved to let him pass by me. And then I looked across the aisle and saw that the two women were also standing. I moved over to the window seat. I could not see how standing up was going to make it light for me. The more we gave in and complied, the worse they treated us. I thought back to the time when I used to sit up all night and didn't sleep, and my grandfather would have his gun right by the fireplace, or if he had his one-horse wagon going anywhere, he always had his gun in the back of the wagon. People always said that I didn't give up my seat because I was tired, but that isn't true. I was not tired physically, or no more tired than I usually was at the end of a working day. I was not old, although some people have an image of me as being old then. I was 42. No, the only tired I was tired of giving in. The driver of the bus saw me still sitting there, and he asked, was I going to stand up? I said, no. He said, well, I'm going to have you arrested. Then I said, you may do that. These were the only words we said to each other. I didn't even know his name, which was James Blake, until we were in court together. He got out of the bus and stayed outside for a few minutes, waiting for the police. As I sat there, I tried not to think about what might happen. I knew that anything was possible. I could be manhandled or beaten. I could be arrested. People have asked me if it occurred to me then that I could be the test case for the NAACP. I did not think about that at all. In fact, if I let myself think too deeply about what might happen to me, I might have gotten off the bus. But I chose to remain. And we know that by her remaining, she was able to set off the bus boycott. And this is where her life became intertwined with Dr. King.
Right.
And he spoke of her as being a person of such high character. And they were so glad that no one could find anything on her. He was saying, "We are here this evening for serious business." This was at a meeting that they called in order to set up the boycott. "We're here this evening for serious business," said Dr. King. "Just the other day, one of the finest citizens in Montgomery was taken from a bus and carried to jail because she refused to give her seat to a white person. I'm happy it happened to a person like Mrs. Parks, for nobody can doubt the boundless outreach of her integrity, the height of her character, the depth of her Christian commitment." And I think that says it all about her.
Yeah.
And that she it can well be called the mother of the civil rights movement, because that caused the boycott to start, and the ministers, they formed the Montgomery Improvement Society because they didn't want them to think that people from the outside had come in. So they started that, and Dr. King was elected the head person to speak. And I think we're about out of time, but there is so much more we could say about her.
I know, there is, but...
And we would like to talk about the honors that she finally received. But she did move to Detroit because neither she nor her husband could find work, and they were constantly being threatened, their lives being threatened, and they moved to Detroit, Michigan. And we know that's where she found work finally with Conyers.
Well, in the movie that you lent me, the husband went through a lot. I mean, he must have worried to death about her.
Yes.
You know, I mean, I think he knew that she was fighting for a great cause, and she was doing this, but I think he was afraid for their lives.
Well, he was, and that's why they finally moved. But he was very sympathetic with her and for the civil rights, because he had fought for it himself. Like I was telling you, he fought for the Scottsboro boys.
But, well, we are about out of time, but I think, I hope everybody else is, gained some knowledge, if you knew it all. Maybe the reinforcement helped. But as for myself, it's like a new chapter. And unlike Tent City, I remember Tent City very well because it was a Sunday morning. I was directing the children's choir for an 8 o'clock service up in 16th Street. Now, I only knew one way to get to church, and that was over the Lincoln Bridge and up Rock Creek Parkway. I had no idea how to get through D.C. Well, just as I'm pulling up to go onto the bridge, state police closed. I'm crying. I'm saying, I don't know where I'm going, you know. And I snaked up all through Georgetown, and I finally got to church about 15 minutes late, but they all knew. They all sat there and said, yeah, she's lost. She's lost. Yeah. But it was just, if I could have gotten over that bridge 5 minutes earlier, I would have been fine. But I remember well the tents, and I can picture them today, and that's has left a picture in my memory for forever, I guess. But and my traumatic trip through D.C. But I survived, and I guess we all did too. So, but we may get back to other shows, and because I just think this is great, and to meet someone who actually you shook hands with, Martin Luther King, and I thought, well, gee, that would be great. It was, that was like I got to shake the hand of the president, while he was here, and which impressed my children. So I think we'll call it for now, and